Hallo alles, willkommen zurück zu .NET API Review. Um, we still have a whole lot of issues, and we get to start off with a fun one, adding param span. Shocker, broke things, um, but not all that bad. So first up, reevaluate params read-only span string overloads from 77873, which is 101261. I can speak. Uh, Devi, Steven.
Yeah. Um, yeah, sure. I'll just to give a bit of context. Well, we are the APIs. Some of them cause a source breaking change for one type that we have on Microsoft extensions primitives, which is called string values. This type contains a string and a string array implicit operator, which is making the compiler it's messing with the compiler when we have these new overloads. Basically, it's that these new APIs, one of the expanded forms of the params read-only spans, conflicts with one of the normal forms of the string array existing one. And so the language rules of C# dictate that native function is better. So that's basically what's happening. So this issue is basically meant to acknowledge that we're okay with the source breaking change, and that we expect consumers to specify what they meant if they hit this specific case. So yeah.
It's very unfortunate that string values has these implicit operators on it. If this issue aside, like both of them can possibly allocate. it's yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Wasn't there a... Go ahead.
This really reinforces the don't add operators just because it's cutesy. Like, they should not have existed.
Wasn't there a language proposal that would say like one operator would be preferred over another in the case of conflict?
So there is a proposal working its way through the system that Fred is driving that basically allows you to specify when there are two possible overloads that could work for something, which one you want to take, which one should have precedent. Not specific to operators, just in general. And I believe that would allow us to slap that onto the read-only span overload for join and just say, or for anything where we had this params string, params span conflict, and say I always prefer the span, and I believe that would resolve the ambiguity. I don't know if Fred's proposal would allow you to put it onto the string and string array operators on string values, if those would be considered two things that could have priority resolved between them, because they're not actually, well, I guess they are overloads. I don't know how if they're considered overloads from a C# perspective. But yeah, if that did allow you to do that, then that would be another workaround. We could just put that on the string values and say, prefer one or the other if both were relevant.
Yeah. So I think the main thing for discussion is adding these params span overloads next to the params array overloads broke things. We have a concrete example. But do we still think it's the right thing to do?
I think it is, and it's the whole purpose. Like it's a key purpose of the param span feature from a C# language perspective. So if this doesn't work, then I think the whole feature needs to be revisited. And so from my perspective, if it ends up just being this one type, I think we accept it. We'd certainly document it as a source breaking change, and we document it and we say, if you're doing it, add an explicit cast, or don't use the operators, use one of the methods that lets you do whatever. If it turns out to be more pervasive than that, with lots and lots of other types that have these kinds of cutesy operators on them, then I think we would need to come up with some mechanism at the C# level to address it, regardless of whether we use the params span or not, because this is one of the ways that it's intended to be used. Anywhere you have a params array, add a params span, and your consumers just get more efficient.
Right.
So that's my perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree. The feature works for anything that is a language-defined cast. It's only once the user-defined conversions come in, because they're so far down in the binding order. But I feel like, David, that if you added if class C also gains an implicit operator to read-only span of string, that will fix it in that it compiles, but it's weird because it doesn't call the overload you would think, right?
Right. So yeah, if you add the implicit operator for read-only span of a string, it will resolve to prefer the string array overload, and that is because there is another section of the C# language that tries to do better conversion, and thinks that since the read-only span has implicit operator since the string array has implicit operator to read-only span, it thinks that the string array is less derived. Sorry, it's more derived, so it's more specific, and that's the one that picks. So yeah, that's also not what expected, but this is how it is.
But if we were to add that to string values, it would resolve the conflict for string values, and you wouldn't end up any worse off than you already are today, right?
What do you mean soft?
I mean, if we were to add the new implicit operator read-only span string to string values, then it would no longer be a source-breaking change for these cases, right?
Right, yes.
And if we did that, even if it maps to string.join taking a string array, that's no worse than what you would get today allocation-wise.
Right.
So it would be weird that if you didn't have, if you would then be able to use string values in this cutesy manner with an overload that took read-only span if there wasn't a string array overload. Where it ends up being weird is A, we'd be doubling down on this implicit operator thing that we don't like, and B, it may not be mapping to the overload that you ideally expected it to.
Right.
Right. Just that bringing that up as we do know of a workaround for anyone with this particular problem. It's a surprising resolution,
Yeah.
but it fixes the compile break.
And the language team's been looped in on the fact that there was a break here, right? And they're going to have a discussion on if they want to do anything about it.
Well, the break that we did, folks were certainly in the loop as to this particular issue, but I don't know of any follow-ups on the language side about it. There was another one that was followed up on yesterday, which was if you are, it has nothing to do with string values, but if you have this same situation where you have the two overloads, params string array and params read-only span, and you upgrade your TFM, but you don't upgrade your language version. So your TFM is net 9.0, but your lang version is 12. Any existing usage of the params array overload, if you already had string join separator comma a comma b comma c, that would then fail to compile because overload resolution would prefer the span overload, and then the lang version would say, but you can't use the params span feature with lang version 12, compiler fail. And so the resolution discussed yesterday to address that was overload resolution will take into account language version effectively.
Mm-hmm.
That param span won't be available if you're targeting as part of overload resolution if you're targeting lang version 12. But if we believe there's subsequent follow-up for, if we want to do something even further for this implicit operator case, I think it'd be a fine discussion to raise. I just don't know if it's on anyone's radar.
Yeah, it was mostly just the consideration of like there's going to be other cases potentially like this where you have something that is both a that is basically both a type and an array of a type, and people are going to have bad implicit conversions like this in places. So is there anything that language wants to do here, or is the answer just when overload priority or whatever the new feature name is called goes in, do we just tell people, break the ambiguity yourself by putting it on your type?
So I'm having a little bit of trouble following this backwards to what the ASP.NET break was. Was it specifically on the string.join method, or was it a different method?
I think it was string.join or string.concat, and it was in a test, right, David?
Right. Yeah, it was in a test. And it was specifically string.join. And then I was just trying to figure out what was the pattern, and then I found like all these other overloads have the same problem.
So the test was basically doing string.join, comma, in quotes, comma, and then a string values, I think, from request headers or response headers.
Sure, and I think the reason I ask is if we think that string.join of string values is going to be like the common break that people observe, I wonder if it would be beneficial to add a join method on string values if we think it's a common enough use case, and just say like, look, string values.join, like instead of string.join.
So effectively, that's what the implicit operator to string does, I believe. I think if there are multiple values, I think it concatenates them. Where is the paper?
You don't get to control the joiner, though, correct?
Correct.
I'm not even sure it's going to be that common, because I don't know how many people are actually providing an implicit overload to both string and string array.
Right.
Especially since the latter implicit conversion is guaranteed to allocate.
Yeah, I'm looking at this. You're Steve, you're right. They use a single comma without a space as a separator.
Yeah.
But I guess what I was saying is like if this really is a special case type, I wonder if we can put an accelerator on the type itself just to make it easier for people.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering about like does the issue was specific for this specific types only? I mean, like string values and strings.
It was specific to a type that had implicit operator, so basically casts to both string and string array. Or
so my question is like any people can write types like this and they can run into the same problem, right?
Yes, although we tell them not to.
Yeah, but it's breaking still, right?
Do what we say, not what we do.
Well, and that's why we're discussing the implications. I'm a little surprised though that this hasn't already come up with this type, because many of these things have overloads to intercept. Like if you do string.concat of two strings. So if you did a string, comma, a string values. Oh, because once you do the comma, it's no longer going to hit the params one. So I guess, I was going to say, I'm surprised that it's not already hitting cases where we have a params overload and, if you just give one string, I can avoid the array. But maybe just nobody's landed it in exactly the right spot.
Yeah, it would be weird to use string values with string concat, which would hit that because string concat does have overloads for one string and for a params array of strings. But if you were to concatenate that, you'd be smashing headers together in the typical string values case with no separator. String join, I don't believe it has overloads that take individual string values.
Yeah, and looks like string format has one object and object array, and I don't know why. I would feel like string format, where the string values was the only parameter you went in, should also be ambiguous. But again, maybe it's so niche that it didn't matter.
The string values, I think, will get boxed to object.
You think it'll prefer the direct? Yeah, I guess that's true, because that's a language defined conversion, not a. That one doesn't require the implicit conversion. Yeah. Object special.
I know, Stefan, what's your? You probably, out of all of us here, use string values the most. What's your feeling on this?
Sorry, I came in a little bit late, so I don't know what the options are. I mean, I'm not terribly surprised that a bunch of implicit conversions and string values has come to bite us.
So options include do nothing, and if someone was passing a string values as the argument to string.join, when the new version ships, they will be forced to kind of explicitly specify a cast. Another option is we could add yet another implicit operator to string values for read-only span of string, which we believe will resolve the ambiguity, but maybe not in the way that someone anticipated. It would probably end up actually using the array-based string.join, which is no worse than today, but maybe confusing if they were to actually look at the IL.
Can you explain that part? Like, why having both the so which overload is it taking right now? Is it string array, or object array? Because I heard you say it might be taking object array.
That was for string.format.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see.
It's string array is a better overload to call than read-only span of string, because string array can be cast to read-only span of string, but the other way around isn't true. So this is if they're equally valid, string array is the better target, according to the language's current resolution rules.
And then if we have an implicit conversion to read-only span of string, it will pick string array because it's still better, but then it's not ambiguous or something.
Right. With string and string array goes here and string goes here, but requires paramsing, and apparently they're at enough of the same level that betterness doesn't apply yet, and it says, you're ambiguous. Tell me what I'm supposed to do. Adding the third one resolves the ambiguity, and then betterness applies, or moves it to betterness needs to win, and then this one wins. So
that's not confusing at all.
Yeah, resolution.
So by adding more options, we're reducing the ambiguity according to the compiler, and even though that's not the option that ends up being picked.
Right. So really, the question, assuming we're not looking at option 3, which is don't put the params word on these span things, is, do you think people will hit these breaks in real code enough that we should do anything about it, or should we make them write the hard casts until they complain?
I think at the minimum we should update string values. It's a common enough type. If you can't use it for things that currently take param string arrays because you're adding these overloads to a bunch of core methods, then we should just, I guess, add the new implicit conversions if that keeps things compiling. I don't love it.
Well, one of the things that I suggested in chat was that instead of an implicit conversion, would it make sense to have a method? You still have the break, but at least it means that you could pass it in as a params raws string argument if you want to, assuming you call the method.
Do we have to break people? How bad is it really to add the new implicit conversion? I get that it adds complexity with these kind of conversations right here. Like which overload gets used really.
I guess maybe it has potential if people have existing overloads in their applications where they have some of their methods take a string array and some of their methods take a raw string. Not params, but just like literally string array and raw string. I wonder if adding an implicit operator will break those call sites. What
Will
if?
they create a new ambiguity without the params? That's interesting.
Yeah. Because we have lots of places within the framework where we take arrays and raws t without params, correct?
That's a good point. We do.
Well,
And-
then, yeah.
Yeah. And with the compiler preferring raws over array is only for params, correct?
There is a separate feature also working its way through the pipeline about making span a first-class language feature, whereas
Okay.
today the language kind of doesn't know anything about it, and that would also end up prioritizing spans over arrays for overload resolution purposes. But I don't know if or when that's going to land.
I see.
Right, so just so we can see what we're talking about.
So I assume the fourth option is to like remove these new overloads, but that's like the thing that people don't like. The new params, raws, overloads.
Right, because it requires that you have this pattern, and I don't think the pattern's common enough that we want to hold everyone back because at least one type did it wrong.
Jeremy, if you uncomment that last line you added,
Yep.
and then from the join methods you remove params from each, that will also be ambiguous, right?
No, I think it won't.
It's not ambiguous, and I don't know which one it's calling.
If you change the results from C# to IL, you can see.
Yeah, it'll give the better string array.
Which is the one you'd want.
Oh, because array has an implicit conversion
Right.
to span.
Yeah. I mean, so what we've learned here today is that the answer is always more implicit conversions. If you have too many, you just need to add more. No.
I mean, once you break a rule, just go all in. Yeah.
Gotta commit.
I mean, the problem that I suggested earlier clearly is not an issue in recent versions of the language. So maybe that is the answer.
As of this is this compiler flavor, so it may not be perfectly up to date, but it was new enough that it had param span, so it would show the ambiguity.
Yeah.
I mean, from a performance perspective, having the equivalent of as span on string values is beneficial because depending on how string values is configured, either of the implicit operators can allocate. Read-only span wouldn't have to. Right? If there's a single value, string won't allocate, but array will. If there's multiple values, array won't allocate, but string will. But read-only span doesn't have to allocate for either.
Well, string values is also, I believe, available on net standard, so that might have to allocate in the worst case.
Oh.
Yeah.
And if the new method is
string
exposed
values
there.
is a struct, right? What I said isn't actually true.
But it is a struct.
Okay, then never mind what I said because it
Oh, yes, you're right.
it wouldn't have to allocate for an array, but it would have to allocate for a single value.
Yes.
It can't
Wait.
make the span
Oh.
of one and return it.
Because there's
It can,
no
but has
address.
to refer to a location.
Yeah. You need the address of the thing that points to the string, not the address of the string itself.
Fair enough.
So with string values as a struct,
Yeah.
Gotta change it to a ref struct. Now,
There you go.
It's not breaking. No. Yeah, so right now, given all three, it would pick string array. Like ideally, it would pick read-only span of string. But string array is better than picking string.
Is this going to change when the language feature for, I don't remember which part of betterness this is, but where span is preferred over array for various overloads due to the new built-in implicit conversions that are going to be understood implicitly by the language?
You're probably the person who would actually be most knowledgeable about that, Tanner, I think.
I don't know what the language. I don't remember where the language landed on that. I don't remember if they decided to just limit it to the params stuff or not. But from what I recall, there was the discussions on specifically for cases like this where you've got both params array and params span. The preference would be to call the span version, and as part of that, there was going to be new the span conversions would become implicit to the language rather than functionally user defined. And so at some point in the future, depending on where the language landed on that, and maybe we should just follow up with Jared, it might change to calling the params read-only span one instead of the string array one.
Which is probably fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it'll break somebody, because everything breaks somebody. Yeah. So I think my personal vote is we put the params back and we make people using string values hardcast.
Yeah.
And if we get a lot of feedback through previews, we change our mind. And if we don't get a lot of feedback until after the release, then we get to have a different data-driven discussion.
I mean,
You
after
can't-
release, our options are limited, right? Because
After
we
the
can't
release,
use that.
we can only do it in the next. We can really only do it in the next
Yeah.
version.
Yeah. You actually don't want to hardcast. You probably want to call to array, just from the point of view of they have different nullability annotations on them. A hardcast could return null, where to array is guaranteed to return non-null.
This class is awesome.
Isn't it? All sorts of fun behaviors.
Fair enough.
Sorry,
But
which
so
which
if-
type is this method on?
Oh, we're talking about string values.
So it's on string values only?
The only type we know that had problems with our new params overloads is string values, and this pair of operators is the reason.
I see.
Is this something that a fixer would be valuable for, or do we think maybe few enough people run into this where a fixer is not worth it?
I would hope it's rare enough that it's not worth it.
Okay.
But I don't know. Stefan, we hit this in one test, as far as I'm aware. Do you have a sense for when people get string values from, ASP.NET headers or whatever, like, what are they doing with it?
I think the more common place to get string values is like a query collection.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's typically it's the core type to read headers and query string parameters. So, I mean, a lot of times people rely on like parameter binding and stuff for like MVC controllers, and that should all be fine. But like in middleware, like I think most of the time people expect there to be single value for these things, or they manually iterate over them. But like, I don't think this will be the only thing you find it. I think it will be rare, but I think other people will run into this. I'm sure other people have passed string values to string.join. Like that in particular, I'm almost sure people have done. Just for like logging, right? And printing it out and stuff.
Yeah, I've done it a lot. I think the problem is like we don't have data for this, unfortunately, because all the usage data is for NuGet packages, really. And yeah, guess what? Nobody's using those types on NuGet packages. But I would venture a guess and say in ASP.NET Core, it's pretty hard to imagine that it's not used a lot. Like maybe not in ASP.NET like websites, but surely when you do web APIs, right? Because that's when you start looking at headers quite a bit.
And I think probably even more common the query string values for like typical web apps. But yeah, both.
Yeah, but even then, I think most of the time when you do query string, you do the, the specialized syntax to actually get it injected, pretty much.
Yeah.
Model binding.
Normally it's parameter bound.
Right, but the question would be then, how often do you take one and you throw it at like, you throw your query string at string.join? Because if you wanted the comma separated thing, I think that's what the toString does.
Yeah,
I mean,
a lot of people
true.
might not know that, and like maybe they want a space in addition to the comma. Like Levi was kind of
Right, but if that's like 3 people on the planet, then they can.
So is it only the combination of people that use string.join with this API?
anyone who's passing it to a params string array that's getting a params read-only span overload.
Oh, I see. I thought it's something else on string. Like if it's only the people that use these two types in combination, I'm venturing a guess and say that's ought to be below 1%.
Yeah.
At which point I'm fine with saying like you need. Yeah, sorry. It's one of those cases where it's a source breaking change. You have to do a cast.
Right. It's because it's you only gave exactly this one item in the spot that is params, because if you gave it twice, now it's obviously converting it to string. Or if you wanted to join it with a prefix, that's now obviously turning it into a string. The only time it's ambiguous is if you have this pair of user-defined conversions without the third one, and you pass it as the only argument in a slot that can now be both params things. Which basically means this is the only line of code that will ever hit it.
And was it really only one line in the ASP.NET Core repo that was broken by this, like in test code? Oh no, it was an actual middleware. It wasn't test code.
Oh, it wasn't test. It was. Yeah.
I mean, it's also.
Oh no, just kidding. It was in a sample, which might as well be a test. No, just kidding. Samples are production code.
I mean, we treat it as representative, right? Not as production. But like, I mean, I would assume if you have it in a sample that it's a fair representation of what people would do in the wild. So
it's like diagnostic output in the response body. I'm looking at it. It's like echoing headers. It's not, but yeah.
But then, so what Jeremy just said is like the third method. We just don't want to add it because it's hacky, or what's the downside of adding it?
So, okay, dear visual controls. So we can add this third implicit conversion, and that will solve the compile break. It doesn't do what anyone thinks it should. How do I get that highlight back up?
Well, it does. It does if you don't have the string array overload as well. And if you have the string array overload, it's no different than if we didn't add the operator.
Well, I think what Jeremy was getting at is most of our RAWs conversion operators are allocation free because RAWs is supposed to be allocation free, whereas this would allocate in the worst case.
Sure, but the other ones do as well.
Yeah, but the other ones, I think people would reason that they would allocate because like strings and arrays like have to be allocated to be useful. Like ROSs are supposed to be non-allocating by their very nature.
I just think
so are
it's
implicit operators.
yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I just think it's weird that somebody looking at the universe is like, oh, we added this new implicit operator. Obviously, it gets called, and what we did is we added this operator so that it never gets called. It just
it gets called
if you assign it.
It only takes a read-only span.
Yes, if you assign it to a thing that is unambiguously read-only span. But the reason we're adding it is to fix a break that causes it to not get called. Like, it's weird that it being there changes the state of the universe.
It's mind-bending. Like, it's one thing if adding an implicit operator resolves ambiguity because it gets chosen.
Yeah.
But because it resolves ambiguity, like adding it, but and it doesn't get chosen, I still don't follow.
So, like, to me, this is more. Like, I guess my position is really we want the params, and we kind of want the language to fix this.
Sorry, can someone explain why it fixes the problem then?
Because without it, there's ambiguity as to are you calling the array overload with the implicit array conversion, or are you calling the span overload with the single string as an element of the params? And so there's no rule in the language today for which of those implicit operators to prefer.
Right.
Adding the overload or adding the operator then, as Stefan said, mind-bendingly allows it to disambiguate because there is an implicit conversion from string array to span. And it does know about that rule.
It changes the rule that the language is resolving against to one that it knows how to resolve, or to one that it knows how to disambiguate.
The crazy thing is, like, I still don't know, like, why it doesn't think string is just as valid as read-only span as string in that scenario.
Well, because this one requires using a paramsing, and these two don't.
Yeah.
These allow a direct call.
Yeah. So it's like, in the first world, we're choosing between the first two overloads, and we don't necessarily know which one's proper. By adding that third overload, you're now getting the language to say, okay, you need to choose between 2 and 3 first. The language says, okay, I chose 2. And now the 1 versus 2 question's kind of moot because 2 won.
Why does it pick 2 though? Like, what? So if it always prefers not paramsing, then it would just have picked string array to begin with.
Yeah, that's the part I don't understand. I think it should have always picked the string array one already. And
well, what I don't understand is, like, I follow everything, but it seems to me that the resulting code I would have expected to go via this newly added operator then.
Yeah.
Because I thought the compiler, like, once you have the choice between a string array params and a read-only span params, I thought it prefers the read-only span one. So, like, why does it go via the array one?
There's no rule. It would prefer the read-only span one if it had a single value and it was having to construct something from it. But it doesn't.
Because it's not calling the params version of these, it's calling the non-params version of these.
Yeah, so basically it's just the conversion between the span and the array one.
Right, and since the array can be cast to the span, it's the same as a derived type being better than a base type. You call the most specialized overload you can. But yeah, to me, we've found a language bug here, and I think we should say we should give the language the first crack at fixing it. We have to make the hard cast in our code because we get the early versions of the compiler.
Yeah, it seems to me like the rules that or the rationale that they have, that when they construct from a single value, would equally apply when you have to choose between a value that you can either convert to an array or to read-only span. Then you should and if they're both applicable, you should prefer the read-only span one. Right? That makes the most sense to me.
if it's just general overloads and not paramsing, I disagree, because we have a lot of code where we hit the we made this work with a span, but think of the way that streams do fallback. If you have an array, it's better to call the array one until you find that your implementation actually understands span. If you prefer the span one first, then you may end up having to create a temporary array to call a compatible overload.
I'm not following. If the compiler sees a call to a method, one takes an array, one takes a span, and the value that you're using can be converted equally to an array or a span, I would generally assume that means the read-only span one should be the better one. Why? That seems like, I understand that we have fallbacks, but from a language standpoint, that's the more reasonable assumption.
Maybe. Really the answer is you should not have had a type that was convertible to both. And the bug here is that these two things should not have been on the same type.
I don't know. If you actually use the string values one, it's, yes, you're allocating, but man, it is so fucking common to have single values, but you also need to handle the multiple values. So it's just, I don't know, I'm not sure I ever used the conversion to the array one, but I'm sure have used the conversion to a single string one implicitly a zillion times.
I think the issue here isn't the fact that the conversion exists on the type, it's that it's implicit. Generally, we say that implicit operators should be lossless, and they should generally not do expensive behaviors, and that really includes allocating as well to many people. So having a two-string API is fine. Having an implicit conversion to string that's potentially going to allocate in a common case is it's problematic for many users, and it's unexpected.
That's fair. I think though you could imagine a world where if we would have done this particular type at the time we had spans, then neither of them would have been allocating.
No, we discussed that one because string values is a struct, it has to allocate.
Maybe I don't understand
Why
what the
does it
backing
have to
thing
allocate
is.
there?
Because my understanding is it's either constructed with a single string or an array of strings. So converting to a span or a single string should not. If your value is a single string, then converting to a single string should be allocation free. And if you're same thing the other way around, right? If you're backed by an array, converting to read-only span should be allocation free. I understand that if you have a conversion from a string to an array, then you have to somehow construct something that actually is an array with one element in it. But
a conversion from a single string to a span would have to allocate, because the span has to refer to a location and doesn't have one. The string values is a struct. It's not a ref struct, it's a struct, so the span can't be constructed around the struct's field.
It can, you just need unscoped ref.
But that would break lots of colors, though.
What I meant was you don't have to allocate when you convert to the thing that you already are, right? As soon as you convert from single to multiple or from multiple to single, yes, you have to allocate, but that's probably not the common case, would be my guess.
With an implicit operator, it's whatever you thought it looked like when you plugged it in a hole.
Right, but that's I think that's kind of use case dependent, right? If you assume you have a query string parameter that you designed to be single value, you treat it as single value. But then, if somebody passes you more than one value, well, then that's the exception to the rule.
Yeah. So to me here, and somebody asked the question, and I agree, it's the weird thing. Because there was already a non-params eligible call, I don't know why the current thing's ambiguous, which is why I think this is just a language bug. They should have seen this operator as being able to call this method before they said, wait, there's a params eligibility problem here.
Yeah, that's the part I agree with.
Alexi has a 3-paragraph explanation for why it's the way it is.
Yeah, but that's why it is the way it is. They should fix it so it isn't.
Sure.
Insert rule 412 before rule 19, and then it'll fix this problem and break 11 other things. So
Well, I think the problem is, I mean, like I defer to the language guys when it comes to like, I mean, in this particular instance, we might be right, but then if we do the thing that, or if they do the thing that we insist here, well, that might make some other scenarios that we think is intuitive no break, right? So like that,
like I said,
that is kind of the.
it would fix one thing and break 18.
Yeah. So then I would agree with like, let's start with, no, you have to cast. And then if we think that's unacceptable, then, you know, as you said, let's get the language guys take another look at this before we add these crazy overloads.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't mind adding this overload if we convince ourselves this is all the freaks, you know, thing here, and we just aid the ergonomics or something. But it does seem a bit odd to add a method that is never being called.
Yep.
At that point, the question is, you know, before we do that, can we put this, you know, hypothetical Jared binary compat attribute on the existing params one? Would that help things along, for example? I would rather do that.
All right. So sounds like for now at least we're happy with. We're going to put all the params as back, and anywhere that as we integrate we see compile failures, we add whatever hard cast we think the right answer is, and then just move on. So we know it's a source breaking change for people who use string values in exactly this pattern.
Yeah,
but we think it will be rare, and we prefer a language solution, and if we don't get a language solution, we have this as a fallback.
Yeah, and generally speaking, I think the error message you're getting is relatively intelligible.
I mean,
yeah, I mean, you pick the one you want, right? And the easy one is just to call toArray on it, right? I mean, it's a.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, I think if you say c.toArray, that's gonna work though, right?
Yeah, you can also hardcast it to string. I just think it's funny that it's like, pick which of these shapes you're trying to call, and that's a pick a shape, and it goes, yeah, you're not allowed to write that line of code. So it's back to the like, then why did you think it was eligible? But like, you can do that. We don't actually have a toArray on this one because it's not string values.
I mean, that kind of makes sense because C itself is not one of those, right? So it's it's basically you're casting it to something that you can only get if you had to pick one of those conversions already. So like, yeah, I get that the language can't do that.
Yeah. So the answer, I think everywhere that it would be ambiguous, the correct answer is string array. So if string values has a
string array, right?
Well, you wouldn't want it to call string if you were trying to call join, because the whole purpose would be that you're trying to change the separator between multiple values. So I think everywhere it's ambiguous, people wanted the array.
Right.
That's my guess. Where again, the ambiguity is basically only this line of code.
So in chat, Tanner pointed out that if you just make the operator in, like have the argument be in.
Oh god.
Like uncomment the last line, Jeremy. And before CC put in.
No.
Except also make it a struct.
Yeah. That if you do that, then that can be implemented to be allocation free for either string or string array.
The new implicit conversions back on the table. More implicit conversions now. Okay. But maybe.
So what's the nonsense that goes here?
New read-only span string in c dot underscore foo. C dot underscore foo.
Oh. All right. So apparently we can make it in an allocation-free way. By just combining more things we told people not to do.
I mean, this forces a compiler to stack spell a copy, so I guess it works, yeah.
Well, and in practice, it's just going to be loaded into. It's going to be inlined and generally optimized away to just refer to ideally the promoted field, anyways. If it really only has a single field and it's being used like that.
So I have a tough time like adding API when we like barely understand why the compiler works the way it does. Did someone drop a link to the 3-paragraph explanation for why we don't just params or don't like prefer the overload that doesn't require paramsing? I know there's a double negative, but
I don't think it is. It
It's
this
on
one?
the original PR. I'll grab it.
Okay.
Hold on.
But on the flip side, like now it seems like a pretty good implicit conversion. Like if we're happy to implicitly convert to array, why shouldn't we implicitly convert to like a thing that never allocates? I mean, it's like the better version. That's why we're trying to get the compiler to prefer it in more places.
I mean, so we can say string values is the only one that's broken, and we now think that there's a way we can add this operator even though it won't get called. But in the future, if it does get called, it would be a better promotion. We can do that. There's still the problem with the pattern. Like if any other types have it, then they'll have to do a similar fix. And click. Alright, so if you know what a normal and expanded form is, then this will probably make sense. And if so, you probably work on the compiler team. So assuming no one wants me to just read this aloud, does reading this change anyone's feeling on anything?
I still think it's something that'd be nice if the language could just, handle, but I understand why it is the way it is.
Can someone translate, or do I just need to think harder as I read this?
Well, because given this first statement, it sounds like it should be saying it should work the way we think the language should. There is a conversion from string values to string array. Params doesn't matter. And then an expanded form is never considered when normal is applicable. So it should have called this one and been done. But then later he says ambiguity is expected. So I don't know why.
Well, they say once you add the new implicit conversion, an ambiguity is expected, and therefore it's No, I don't know.
No,
I'm probably misreading it.
adding the new implicit conversion removes the ambiguity for reasons. For betterness
It
reasons.
would have been on his radar probably at that point anyway.
Right.
He's writing his comment. Yeah.
Yeah, so no matter what, the pattern when we put the params back, because nobody's saying we should leave it out, which is good. So when we put the params back, anyone with this pattern will be broken unless the language fixes it. We have the option of fixing the one break we know about by adding this guy, and just to prove that it, still fixes it, I can delete the cast. But it still doesn't call the new overload, which is why we're all confused. But we don't work on the compiler. And so we can add this to the one type we know has this problem, because we found that we can actually write this in a sane manner, and then say, hooray, hopefully no one else was crazy enough to have a string and string array conversion on the same type. Or we just put params back and let them cast this. So, what's the room feel?
I'd be inclined to add the cast. It's already crazy. Make it a little more crazy, and it has a chance of doing the right thing in the future when there's a betterness rule about spans.
Yeah, I agree.
And presumably this is you're happy with it now that it has a non-allocating answer?
It definitely
I'm more happy with it, or happier with it.
Okay.
I was actually okay with it even when it was allocating. I wouldn't have been with an explicit as span method, but implicit operators are implicit, they're hidden. And so in the situation where it would allocate, you were already allocating if you were binding to string array.
Fair enough.
The owners of string values would need to figure out what the net standard implementation would do. Presumably just allocate and say, okay, we allocated.
Or they just don't put it in the net standard ref.
Fair.
That's an interesting.
And this isn't going to
thought.
be an issue for a lot of our params APIs, because we've historically often had params T, and also often had 1, 2, and 3 parameter overloads. So ones that explicitly take T item 1, item 2, and T item 1, item 2, item 3. So that would also break the ambiguity, and we just don't have it on string because it didn't make sense for string, right?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense to join a single string.
It's like it's basically concat, but
Yeah, I don't know why we have concat with a single argument either. that one's always amused me.
yeah.
Right, but yeah, so if we'd had a single string overload of join, then passing C here would be equally ambiguous. But we don't, because it made no sense.
Yeah, I would vote for adding the implicit operator and keeping it in that standard with the allocation. Having different APIs between different TFMs is annoying and less necessary.
I mean, we do that now in a non-trivial number of cases. Like,
We do, but like, do we like it? Like if you're multi-targeting, it can cause weirdness. Like if you're calling a thing that explicitly takes like read-only span or.
I mean, it's probably fine. Since the place, yeah. Well, if you're calling a thing that takes a read-only span and you don't have the overload that takes a read-only span, it should still think that the conversion to array would work. And if it doesn't, then again, you can hardcast it.
I mean, I guess the point is, like, what if there's no overloads? Like, what if you're just calling a method that expects a read-only span of string with string values and you're multi-targeting? Like, it'll compile in, like, net9, but not in net standard. And, like, in net standard, there wouldn't even be, like, an explicit thing to do other than, I guess you could call toArray, and then you'll get the implicit conversion. But, yeah.
It's no worse than you are today, right?
Yeah, I mean, but, like, why not add it, I guess is the point. Like, just because it allocates.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't think you can declare it in net standard. Or can you?
Why not?
I don't remember if net standard has enough of the pieces that are required for putting that keyword there. Net standard is really old.
In is just ref with an attribute that the compiler can synthesize.
Okay.
I don't know why that one wouldn't work.
Okay, it doesn't. It's not one of the ones that peeks into does the runtime I'm on even support this concept?
I don't believe so.
No, and the runtime has no understanding of in or ref read only. As far as the runtime's concerned, it's just a ref. Out is technically the same way. The runtime has no implicit understanding of out. It's literally just a ref with a special attribute that only the higher level language cares about.
So why does it have to allocate if you can take an in parameter? Sorry if it's, like, obvious.
The span on .NET Framework can't refer to refs. It's the slow span versus fast span thing of a few years ago.
Okay.
Span actually stores an object.
Got it. Yeah. Just a normal object.
Okay. Alright. Anyone with this pattern will be broken. We think that's fine. There's a workaround. The one type we know that was broken, we're going to add the workaround.
On line 10, that should be string values, but yeah.
That matches the signature of the array one. No, wait, that's the backwards one. There we go. All right, so David put all the params back. I guess maybe adding the operator first so it won't break upstream. Downstream? Downstream. Stream people.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. To something less complicated. Support adding links to activity after it's created. 97680.
Yes. In my experience, nothing is simple. Anyway, yeah, I mean, so in tracing, I mean, we have the activity object that it's used for tracing, and a couple of of releases ago, we added features called links, which is you can link the activity to other tracing contexts. I mean, this is useful in the patch operation while you have multiple tracing at the same time and you want to relate between them. So you can link the activity with other tracing information. During that time, I mean, we were conforming with the OpenTelemetry specs that the specs was strict, telling about like you cannot add links except during the creation only of the activity. I mean, like after you create the activity, you are not allowed to add links. But recently they relaxed this requirements. I mean, in the recent changes in the OpenTelemetry specs, they allow to add links after you create the activity. So this API is just like to add this. I mean, to allow adding link to the activity after it get created. Of course, I mean, like there are multiple parties. I mean, waiting. I mean, like they want to use this functionality. So basically, about like the API is just like as it says about add link, and you can the activity link to as a parameter, and we can just add it to the activity. So that's all.
What is the activity that's being returned from addlink?
It's the same. It's the same objects that you are calling the addlink on.
So this is for some kind of fluency?
Yeah, I mean it's just the pattern that it uses. I mean like add tag or add something. I mean it just returns the same object.
I see. So we already do this on activity.
Yeah. I don't like this pattern, but we do.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I see it on add tag, add event, set tag, add baggage. They all return this.
Yes.
Okay.
Is there any surprising failure mode with addlink?
No, activity link, I think it's struct already. I mean, so you cannot have like even.
Sure, I just mean, is it like, is there anything weird like you can't call this after you've called like set end time, or is this always valid to call?
It's valid to call.
Okay. Just making sure that there's not a state somewhere that we need to add, or add try add link, or anything complicated like that. So,
any question, any feedback?
What happens if you add the same link multiple times? Is that
Yeah,
fine?
we just added. We don't do any validation. I mean, it's up to the caller to do whatever they want.
Seems fine.
sold.
One question. I noticed in the create method. Oh, never mind. Ignore me. I read it wrong.
Okay.
Sold for real. Get rid of blocking. There we go. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tadek. I should know this one, but it's not coming to mind. Arabic's hard. Wait, Shokran. Yeah, that one.
One.
All right. Add an STJ feature flag recognizing NRTs on properties. 100144.
Yeah, I suppose I can speak to that. I think we have David in the meeting as well. So this is a fairly old feature request. Basically, System.Text.Json so far hasn't been honoring knowable reference type annotations, and this is something that users have been asking for a while. this is actually possible today using the recently added availability info context APIs in System.Reflection for the case of the reflection-based serializer, and of course in the source generator it is possible to do so via the Roslyn APIs. And this basically proposes to just have both. Optionally try to honor non-nullable reference type annotations wherever they are present. That would be a breaking change, of course. So the default API proposal here is to expose a feature switch that lets people opt into the good behavior. I think we can have a debate as to whether we want this to be an opt-in or an opt-out, but the safe approach is to have it as an opt-in. And then, of course, this would also be exposed in the contract metadata via a couple of properties that users can override, namely one that toggles whether null values should be accepted on writes, and another one that toggles whether null reads should be accepted on deserialization.
So when you talk about null reads and writes, the idea is if I have null in the JSON payload and the property setter does not allow nulls, like this would actually just throw an exception now, correct?
So in this case, this doesn't govern the handling of JSON nulls. It only governs the handling of .NET nulls. In this case, if you're deserializing for a property and you have a converter that reads a bunch of JSON, which might be JSON null, but it might be something else, and the result of that deserialization is a .NET null, and you attempt to call the property setter for a non-nullable property, should you fail deserialization.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I'm having a little bit of trouble wrapping my mind around the read semantics, though. Like how it's different for property getters versus property setters.
So if this is false, does it throws if null would have been assigned?
Correct.
Okay, and if
maybe it's the null rights that I'm confused by.
So what does null rights mean?
So this would be, I think it's debatable as to whether this is desirable, but the idea is, suppose you're trying to serialize an object that has a property that is explicitly declared as non-nullable, and the property getter, for whatever reason, returns null. Do you want the serializer to catch this before it gets, say, written to the database, for instance? Do you want to be able to make sure that you don't serialize data that contradicts the nullability annotation of the property getter?
So you're contemplating an object which has been constructed improperly.
Correct. Yeah.
So again, this is that you would throw. It's not don't write down that this property even existed. So it's not skip the property. It's fail because the property lied.
Fail. Yeah. This input violates the contract for the type.
I don't necessarily know if this is the right layer for that, to be honest, because when we're talking about like schema validation, like the JSON serializer is not a database. Like the only thing it's doing is it's saying like, okay, I read a property and I'm throwing it out on the wire. But like at the point where that's ingested into the database is really where that logic should take place, no?
Yeah, I mean, the serializer isn't a validation engine as such, but it does have elements of validation. For example, it currently does honor required properties, for instance. So if you're trying to deserialize an object and there's no corresponding property that is able to bind to a member marked required, then again, deserialization would fail.
Well, along those lines, like one common security vulnerability in web applications is something called underbinding, where an object expects the user to populate, say, 10 properties, but the user really only sends enough data to populate 2 of them, and then the other 8 stay either uninitialized, or maybe they retain their original values from the database if it's a patch operation or whatever, right? So it sounds like what you're suggesting is it's not just enough to mark the properties as nullable and opt into this feature, you also have to mark them as required in order for them to be guaranteed populated.
Correct. But this only controls the nullability dimension. It doesn't govern the dimension of whether something is populated at all, which is also the case for required members, because you can explicitly set a required member to null. The compiler only cares that you set it to something, and if that agrees with the annotation, then null's fine. You've set a required member to null.
My gut tells me this is going to confuse people, because my gut tells me that people are going to assume that the nullable annotations on types means this has to be set before the object is returned, because that's what the C# compiler would mandate anyway, or else it would produce warnings. And then they're going to say like, oh, well, if System.Text.Json now honors those same nullable annotations, now it's not going to allow the object to be half populated before returning it to me. But from what you're saying, like, yes, it will actually allow that, because separate annotations are required to enforce that behavior.
I'm not sure I follow your line of reasoning, to be honest.
Yeah, the language absolutely does not require that you assign properties that are marked non-nullable.
It will warn. And if you have warnings as errors, it absolutely will.
Declare a class, give it 11 properties, call the default constructor. It thinks that's totally valid. It was up to the constructor to write the code.
Yeah. It would be within the constructor, the init statement. I think I'm thinking like init properties. Yes.
It may be true for init properties. I don't use those.
Yeah. Oh, you should. They're great.
They're terrible.
Curmudgeon. The lovable curmudgeon.
Right. Anything added after auto properties is bad.
Talking about, it would be like required in it, right? That's why we have that feature now.
And System.Text.Json honors init properties then?
Yeah.
Okay, then I retract my concern then.
So, I don't like this because the nullable annotations don't enforce nullarity at all. And that's why this is currently letting nulls through, is the compiler doesn't generate a null guard in the setter. It doesn't have a null prevention emitter in the getter. They're just a sugar, and you can come up with any sort of contract thing. Like, this is an int, but it's not allowed to be 0. Well, are we now going to go add a feature, don't allow zeros? Like, so...
I mean, that's what data annotations is, technically.
Yep.
And if we respect data annotations, then maybe this is the only missing feature, and it's fine. But if this is just, like, the first step along the way of doing it, then I would say we should wait until we actually do it.
I think a similar argument could be made about required. Like, for example, when the required keyword came out, I think it was a couple of releases ago, System.Text.Json didn't honor the keyword, which meant that, well, in the case of the source generator, of course, if you try to source generate for anything with a required keyword, it would result in uncompilable code, of course. But for the case of the reflection-based serializer, it would, not care, because it's like a compile time feature, obviously. So our choice to make the reflection-based serializer honor the required keyword isn't because of the language semantics forcing us to do this. It was just a matter of convention. So we kind of decided that required conveys intention, and it conveys aspects of the contract of the type design that should be honored in a different semantic domain, which is serialization in this case. I feel that the same principle should apply for nullability annotations. You're right that there's no runtime enforcement for nullability annotations when used within the language, but they are a very useful tool when it comes to conveying intent as to what exactly you're looking to get back from your type. And I think the value here comes as well that if you're deserializing something, that if you deserialize a type graph that contains non-nullable annotations and you get back a POCO, then some users would expect that if they're evaluating a nested property within that POCO that is marked non-nullable, that should save them from the from the hassle of having to check if that non-nullable property is actually non-nullable. And I should also say that there's a hidden agenda here. The reason why we're bringing this API proposal forward today is because this is actually useful from the perspective of JSON schema generation. In the case of JSON schema, we found that it's actually very valuable that we use nullability annotations and we surface them in the generated schemas for particular types. If we were to use the current semantics of System.Text.Json, which is agnostic with respect to reference types, and we just map that out faithfully to a JSON schema, you'd end up in a situation where everything is marked as potentially null, which I've received feedback results in unclean JSON schemas. So we actually want that additional dimension, not only to enable it in the serializer, which does the actual work of converting .NET objects to JSON and backwards again, but we also need that information both from the reflection-based serializer and from the source generator to be able to export schemas.
I still feel like it belongs with a generalized contract layer.
So the reason why I don't subscribe to that, I mean, I think there is an argument to be made that that's useful to have data annotation enforcement in the serializer in the same way that we have it for ASP.NET's options, for example. But I do think null annotations are qualitatively different because they are part of the type system, right? You don't have a type system way to say this property shall be in the range of 5 to 10, right? You can have attributes on that, but that's all on top of it, right? But if something is in the type system, I do think that people that read code have reasonable assumptions about what should happen. And I think it's bad enough that we don't have runtime enforcement for nullability, right? But that was a pragmatic concession of where we are. But it does seem like when we have serializers that it's reasonable for us to say, hey, we give you a way to enforce them, so you don't have to have that busy code all over the place, right? And that is, I think, also similar with the prior art, right? As you said, like we already did it for the required keyword, right?
Yeah, and there is something to be said that like the value that a serializer brings is that it matches people's expectations when constructing objects as they would have done in code. And if they wouldn't have been able to do something in code following normal patterns, then they, in theory, a serializer shouldn't have done it either. Like that matches people's expectations.
Yeah, speaking of expectations, what is going to be the default? I know that if we set it to true, it's a breaking change, but would we be willing to do that?
I would hate if we did that because we kind of make the decision that what we shipped before nullable reference type annotations were a thing is going to be the default forever. But at the same time, I don't think we should consider making true the default without also including a feature switch that at least doesn't force people to recompile code just to get back the original behavior. Because I expect people will get bitten by this.
So I'm not entirely sure which side you're arguing for. Are you arguing for the default should be we honor them, or the default should be we don't honor them because that's what we shipped before?
So the safe option is we set the default to false, and we preserve the original behavior. I don't like that, but it's kind of the path of least resistance given what we already have. But if we wanted to do this the right way, and of course frustrate some of our customers, we would make true the default, but I think we would need to additionally expose a feature switch.
Yes. So that one I completely agree with you. But I think to me, like I am similar, and I would hate if we ship this feature and the default behavior is we do nothing, right? It's the previous behavior. I think what I would prefer is we ship it, we turn it on by default, we say, yeah, it's a breaking change from before, but it's probably what you expected to happen all along. So if your code doesn't work, well, then you fix your annotations because you clearly lied.
I mean, lots of people do that all the time. So, like, I think a healthy chunk of STJ users will have to deal with issues around that. So we really need to communicate if we do go with a break change.
Yes. I think required was different, right? Because when we introduced it, you couldn't have said it before, right? So.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to me it comes down to like expectations, right? As Levi said, I think if you look at a minimal API sample code, right, where somebody takes some payload from the wire, right, declares a type, marks all their stuff as non-nullable, right, and then the first line again that they have to write on the other side is, well, I got this object, now I have to do all these null checks, and it's kind of weird to do with serialization because in your own code you only do it in the implementation of the property, right? Versus in this case, you would have to do it after you got the property. So, after you got the instance. But the instance is already constructed, and now you're validating things that the instance says can't happen. So it's a very unintuitive way to do these checks. And the only way around that I found was basically not having properties that are setters. I basically only ever have constructors and do it in constructors, but that only works for cases where your types are read-only, right? It doesn't really work for cases where you have read-write semantics.
I mean, you can do it with a property. You just have to expand it off of an auto prop and add the null guard yourself. You can make your setter through.
I mean, are we calling the property if the payload didn't specify it? I thought we don't even call it.
We don't.
So yeah, you have no way to enforce it then, right?
Well, this
code never executes.
But this isn't going to force you to call this isn't required. This doesn't say you have to call the set on a thing. So if the constructor leaves a property in a default null state, it's null.
Well, then they get a warning.
Fair enough. Yeah, basically you're saying if you have a POCO, basically your constructor have to set it to non-null values.
Right.
And then if the serializer never calls it, well, then it's still in the non-null state that the constructor gave it. Yeah, I guess that's fair.
If you have a non-nullable property and you have a constructor that doesn't set that property, you would get a compiler warning.
Yeah, it's your fault. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Right. But so this just says the letters NULL appeared in the JSON payload, or the converter turned a complicated object into the null object.
Right.
Does the serializer layer do that guard, or was it up to the setter to do that guard?
That would be done by the serializer.
That's this feature. The feature is that the serializer does it, instead of saying it's up to each individual setter to determine their fate.
There's a reason for that. Like, we could, of course, encapsulate the check into the setter delegate, but then we lose this metadata that's necessary for schema generation. I think maybe another point to bring up here is whether folks are happy with the way that the properties are designed. Currently, like, they're rendered kind of simply, allow null writes and allow null reads, but I'm wondering if we might want to expose, for example, the nullability state enum, which has more information, probably more information than a serializer needs, but that would be a more kind of apt representation of what we actually use as state when describing nullable reference types. The nullability state enum, I just shared it in chat, has 3 possible states. So it's unknown, not null, and nullable. But of course, that's not a normal form from the perspective of serialization. More checks need to be made on that.
Yeah, okay, so these two properties, they're already describing a specific property. And if this is true after we settle on whatever its name's going to be, this becomes false if it's declared as a non-nullable type.
Yeah.
But if you're not respecting nullable annotations or its state is unknown, then allow null rights is true.
Good question. I think it's interesting to consider what this would return if the property is not a reference type, or maybe if it's a nullable of T. So my thinking here is, and that's implementation rather than API design, but my thinking here would be to have this fixed to false for non-nullable value types, set it to always be true for the case of nullable of T because there's no alternative, and make it settable exclusively for, changeable rather, for reference types.
Right. Well, the reason I'm bringing it up now and asking what the truth table looks like is finding out if allow null is the right description of this. Because is the logic that reads this basically going to say if not allow null and value is null throw?
Yeah.
So anywhere that the null might have been legal, the metadata builder will say allow null is true, and it's only when it's a normal value type or a non-null declared reference type will it say false.
One possibility here is, because like you said, you'd need to negate that. Maybe we might consider naming this disallow null, also in recognition that before for a project without non-nullable reference types, that would always be false. So basically expose the negations of these properties. And I think disallow null already exists, at least in some of the attributes. Yeah, so we have a disallow null attribute in system diagnostics.
Right. Okay, so yeah, it was the question was down to was this just copying this value, or is it evaluating the actual state relevant to the specific property? And
it would be evaluating the state.
Okay. Yeah, I think disallow seems fine.
Yeah. Perhaps one other point worth mentioning, I think most people here might know this, but of course we are not able to do nullable reference type resolution for root level types, and we will not be able to do non-nullable reference type resolution for any generic types. So any collection elements or any properties that are generic that you instantiate to a string question mark, the serializer would be oblivious to that, which might confuse users.
Fair. So how does anybody feel about the main entry point names? Because to me it seems more like consider nullable annotations, but I think the feature is actually called nullable reference types.
Yeah, I don't like the word resolve there because resolving types does have a very specific meaning in reflection. Aside from resolve as a verb, I'm okay.
Can we do like respect nullable annotations? I feel like that's clear to the layman.
I'm happy with that. I just don't know if we have a concern of, I'll just say branding of nullable reference types versus nullable annotations. I think nullable annotations is clearer, but I don't think it's what the feature's called.
Yeah, I think nullable annotations is a lot clearer, but I don't know how often we refer to it in APIs.
There's also bifurcation between nullable reference types. I think technically the correct term is non-nullable reference types, but that's just too ugly for it to live in an API. So I think nullable annotation sounds good to me as well, as a kind of a greater umbrella term.
We could say that from the library's perspective, it's nullable annotations. And from the language perspective, it's non-nullable reference types. I think that somewhat makes sense because as far as the languages exposes it, you actually have a type distinction. But as far as the libraries are concerned, it's really just annotations.
Yeah. In system reflection, we call it nullability info. I'm not sure if that could feed into how we name things here.
I think a lot of people interacting with System.Text.Json aren't doing a lot of reflection. So, yeah, I mean, some people do, but like, probably not the majority of users.
Do we have a precedent for using respect as a verb in APIs?
I don't think so.
Honor?
Honor sounds more familiar.
So I see respect case and in unit, nothing under system, assuming that Emo's thing gives priority to system. Also, it's not a lot of hits.
Yeah.
Honor is never used.
There's respect the browser accept header for MVC options.
Yes. Im.
I'm okay with honor, but I prefer respect. Honor's not widely used either.
Honor is never used.
Yeah. I think I prefer respect, but
I don't even see where honor exists in this one.
I feel like consider is like not strong enough of a word though.
Apparently we also don't use consider.
Yeah. I like respect. Show those annotations are proper respect.
I mean, we could call it read.
That's just too vague of a term.
Use. I'm pretty sure we use all the time. But yeah, I feel like respect is more the...
I think people will understand what it means. So actually,
evaluate may also be reasonable.
Maybe we might want to pivot on the choice of name here. And the reason why I'm saying that is the second API proposal that I have in for review, which is in the second tab, is very closely related to this one. And it might be conceivable that they could be grouped together into a sort of umbrella of breaking changes, let's say. So I don't know if it's appropriate. Maybe I can take you through this one as well so that we can consider them in unison, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So as shipped, System.Text.Json has been treating constructor parameters as optional, which means that when you're deserializing and a JSON payload doesn't specify a particular constructor parameter, the deserializer will just feed the default value for that thing into the constructor parameter, and all fun things could happen. One of the reasons why that's the case is that when constructor support was implemented, there wasn't a concept of required data in the first place. So that's kind of just an accident of history. But now we do have that feature since a couple of releases ago. And again, coming from the perspective of exposing accurate schemas, I'm looking to basically expose a feature switch that changes this behavior so that constructor parameters become required, which will be reflected via the pre-existing JS property info dot is required property that the C# required keyword also maps to. It feels to me that it's very likely that we could group these two into a single feature flag called, I don't know, use nice properties when deserializing. I don't know.
So, I guess I don't understand on this one with the constructor for person as listed, requiring like name and age are both required parameters. So what gets passed right now for age if it's not specified? 0?
0.
That's surprising. So this says anything that still had a default value would be not required,
Right.
but a thing from a constructor is required. But how are you? That makes sense for things like record, where there's probably only one constructor. But if you have overloaded constructors on a type because there's a default, does that mean they're all optional?
There's a disambiguation. So you can only use one constructor per type, and there's a disambiguation mechanism via a certain attribute called JSON constructor attribute. So if you have a type that has more than one publicly exposed constructors, you'll get an error if you try to deserialize unless you nominate the specific one you want to use for deserialization purposes.
Okay. So, yeah, a thing for this feature and the other feature a little bit, it surprises me that we're talking about these things that apply to the type level and property level, but you can't specify it at the type level. You only specify it as the big switch in your local serialization options, which, assuming it's the type that you're serializing is the root type, or the one you care about is the root type, then it matches. But like this, if person is a property within the root type that you want, you're now changing how it serializes by changing the options for your root type.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a better piece of data for that. Just it feels slightly mismatched to me that this is a type local problem, but you get it as the context global, which is better than a full global. But
there exist APIs that let you control this behavior on the individual parameter level. So it's the JSON property info dot is required property. So you are able to do this programmatically. There's also an attribute that you can specify on a per parameter level, but this is a question of what do we want the defaults to be, and
right.
It's basically we are accepting that we slightly messed up with the defaults as originally shipped. It's creating headaches from the perspective of schema generation? Can we have a way in which we can course correct?
Right. Because what's interesting on this one is I actually thought this is the feature that you added when you added the ability to call constructors. Like, I thought that formal parameters were required.
No.
Which means on this one, I think the default should be true.
Yeah, breaking change again, though.
Yep. But yeah, so I guess you're bringing it up now, not so we can name them consistently, but I think you're asking, should we make them be the same switch?
I think so. Could we come up with a good name that groups them together? It might be the case they're not exactly like you know you can see that they dovetail, but they're not the same thing. They're not the exact same behavior. So it might be that we shouldn't do that and just focus on the individual proposals.
I agree. I wouldn't try to merge those concepts. It ends up being hard to name and explain if it's one has nothing to do with nullability annotations, right?
It's also point in time, because what you're saying is you think these are two mea culpas, but that would really mean you just call it mea culpa 2024, because in 2 years right. When we come up with the well, this fits the super generic description we gave this thing in 2024, but it should be an independent toggle because otherwise we can't recreate 2025. And so especially if we're doing it as a mea culpa and not a nice to have add-on, and we're making them on by default, the more granular control is fine.
Sure.
I'm aware it's more complicated testing and implementation, but
I was mostly concerned if we decided to make these opt-in, then it would mean that getting a well-behaved serializer would have you kind of setting a bunch of feature flags to true, and the list would only grow. But if we're actually making them opt out, then I'm not as concerned.
I mean, it's a huge breaking change, but I like the changes.
Yep.
Like if you have the nullable annotations, because you can tell, right, based on the nullability info API, whether it's nullable oblivious versus actually annotated. Then yeah, I think respect and require should probably default to true, these two things we've been talking about. The respect nullability annotations and require constructor parameters.
Yep.
And we don't care about the defaults for Boolean options being true versus false, right? For extensions.options, I think we sometimes kind of do, but...
And we have a bias toward making the word be if you're looking at this word, you wanted it to be different. So, on the one hand, respect nullable annotations, true, false is... we could say we don't care what the default is, but... sometimes we say, if we're going to make it true, if we're going to make them be respected by default, then we want to name the property, ignore nullable annotations, because then if it appears in your code, what you were trying to do was ignore it.
Right, and ignore is common in APIs, so that's another plus for that. And if the actual default would be false, I don't know how you, assuming you want required constructor parameters to default to true, basically, I don't know how you invert that and keep as good of a name.
Default all constructor parameters?
Yeah, that's way worse. Right, so in that case, I would just default it to true.
But yeah, so I mean
But ignore is good.
Yeah, so if we were having trouble with the name here, then maybe what we want is not respect, we want ignore and invert the logic.
I'm okay with that.
It's good to me. Feature switch?
App context?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I assume just whatever the existing pattern is and matching the, or, default, ignore nullable annotations.
Yeah, our prior art was to just do System.Text.Json serializer options ignore nullable annotations default, maybe.
If you've been doing it
think
as a
that's-
suffix, then yeah, I would do it as a prefix. But
Yeah, I don't know.
I've noticed that there's like guidelines for app context switches that say they should start with switch dot, but I don't think we've done that much.
that definitely was the case when we introduced them. I didn't understand why, but when I had to add switches in NetFX, I did it because otherwise code review would tell me I had to. And but as long as we're consistent, especially locally consistent, like don't if STJ is already using switch dot, use switch dot, and if it's already not, then don't.
Makes sense.
And is reflection enabled by default map to a property, or is that just a concept switch?
It does, and it's identically named, and it's a constant as well. So it's slightly different use case. So I think
Do you want to go with the suffix?
I'm a fan of by.
Yeah, just get rid of the by, I think. It's just like the default value for that thing.
You're the UX guy, Emo. Do you like default as a suffix or a prefix here? It's an app context switch, so maybe you don't care, but
I see the entire prefix as like a really long adjective describing which default we're talking about.
fair enough.
Yeah, that's the problem. But I think it's fine as a suffix.
Okay. So the real equals comes from app context, but the ultimate default is false.
Yeah, if you really wanted to rename that switch, you could prefix it with like global or something, but people can read docs and figure out what it is.
Yep. All right. So we happy with this one? And can we come up with a name for the constructor one in like 3 minutes? Or do we need to punt that to next time?
I like the name if we don't have to invert it. Like, just default it to true.
Because it's, yeah, I mean, the previous iteration is a little more clear as to when it applies, because it's not requiring all constructor parameters, it's requiring non-defaulted constructor parameters, aka non-optional constructor parameters.
I think I actually changed that because there was a lot of negative feedback in the comments as well.
If you have a nullable constructor parameter that doesn't have a default value of equals null, is that still going to be required?
I would think so, yeah. Similar to a nullable required member.
Okay.
So if the compiler forces you to pass a value, then the JSON's forced to specify it.
Yep.
And one thing that I find kind of interesting about this is, like, on the last one, we introduced a new like allow null write and null read on like the JSON type info or something, but no attribute. And this one has like an attribute but no like thing that you can put on the JSON type info. Like the other one could have had an attribute too.
I think you said it's already there.
Uh,
It's they're going to reuse as required.
Yeah. JSON property info.
but you can't put that on like a class, right? You'd have to put that on each property.
Correct. Yeah.
Whereas like, so the other one, will that be attribute that goes on the constructor? Actually, yeah. What are
No,
you binding?
This attribute is for the source generator. It's the source generator version of the serializer option.
It doesn't derive from attribute either. Okay, now I see.
Well, I mean, it does, just in the other partials.
Oh, okay. I see. You're just adding a bool to the existing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're all globals.
Because, yeah, I mean, you get required constructor parameters, which, I mean, it's true. It just sounds redundant.
Right. It should be implied that like defaults, like if they're there, are always okay, assuming the argument is missing. Like, sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, we could say that this is good enough, and docs will clarify that it doesn't apply to a constructor parameter with a default value. But,
Yeah, inverting it's hard because I think it's so many people's expected behavior already. So it's just like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know. I guess what would be like.
yeah, that, like I said, I thought that was actually the point of the feature previously, was so you could have a get only property and that they were required because they were in the constructor. I didn't know that the behavior was it looks at all the constructor parameters, creates a local for them, assigns them to default, and then overwrites them if they see a word.
So the tricky, well, slightly tricky, is this definitely does need an app context switch too, right?
Yep.
And then in this case, like, if there's, try get switch returns false, then we'll default to true, and otherwise we'll use whatever it is. Yeah. All right.
So yeah, the only thing is, do we think the name is good enough? Or does it imply that it would make address required here?
It barely implies it, and like I think it's not worth making the name longer, and we can clarify that in doc comments.
It would require a very pedantic interpretation of the name to make that inference.
The only thing that makes it weird is people might think that, like, of course, like, you always require non-defaulted constructor parameters, so, like, why else would there be an option?
Right.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right, because looking at it, I 100% thought that this was saying treat defaulted parameters as required, because obviously the non-defaulted ones were already required.
Yeah, that's the argument against it. Yeah.
Because obviously.
Because obviously, like, why would there be an option for the non-defaulted ones? No, I mean, it's true.
But, yeah. Emo, Tanner, Levi, if any of you think that the name as presented is sufficient for the concept, then we can just say it's clarified in docs.
And we call it require mandatory constructor parameters. I use a synonym.
Sure.
Not sure if mandatory is standard in this context.
Sure. Yeah.
I honestly prefer non-optional over mandatory. It's more clear. I know you got beat up for it in the comments, you said, but like if we're going that route, like non-optional is more clear than mandatory, I think. Just
To non-English speakers, it would be yes. I agree. Especially because there is an is optional property on the parameter, and it maps nicely to that.
Yeah, so the word the compiler uses is required.
required parameters. Required
parameters.
Ignore required constructor parameters. False.
I mean, that almost works.
It leaves out the notion of what you're doing with non-required parameters, but.
Or you could do like.
I mean, you may think it sounds ridiculous, but I'm going to write it down to see what it looks like.
Or like, or provide defaults for required constructor parameters.
Yeah, I would probably say skip instead of ignore because like it does have to do something.
Well, it ignores the required bit.
Yeah.
I think we also need to. I think using the term required here is essential in one way or another because it does connect to the existing is required feature and the required keywords. So that's what I think. What I take issue with the second name is that the action of this feature uses the verb ignore, but we're not ignoring. And there's another thing called JSON ignore, which is a completely different thing. And ignore in the context of JSON is skipping, and it only works on serialization, not deserialization.
Provide default for required constructor parameters. It's such a mouthful, but hopefully no one wants to change it.
Chat hasn't written anything useful. Because yeah, from matching what the compiler error message is.
Required.
Like, or respect required, or going back to introducing respect.
We could do respect.
Yeah. Yep, I like that.
Actually required.
All right, we happy?
Yep. Any chance
Yeah,
we could propose a name for the feature switch as well for guidance? I'm guessing we're just following the same nomenclature as the previous one.
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just trying to avoid undo close tab, but I've done it, so. All right.
Thank you.
And that should clear the final red for today. And then I'm sure we'll be back next time with more red issues because they keep popping up. So, thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you particularly enjoyed our hour-long debate on what to do about param span breaking things. And yeah, see you all at our. Actually, are we having a meeting on Tuesday? Sorry, Thursday.
I think that was depending on readiness, right? So should I set up a meeting, Tanner?
I think we were also depending on if there was going to be quorum or not, because it sounded like we might not have quorum.
Yes, that's
Yeah.
also true.
Fair enough. So we'll maybe see people this Thursday at 10 a.m. Redmond time, and if whether or not we're here on Thursday, we'll be back next Tuesday, 10 a.m. Redmond time. So see you at our same .NET time on our same .NET channel. The day is TBD. Ciao.
Ciao, Bella.
Bye bye.